So I don't read very often, or as often as I would like to, or very often at all. In addition to ADHD reasons of just instead doing more dopamine stimulating things like Instagram, and then also just losing focus. It's also because just get overwhelmed by either a response I have to the idea or how sort of perfect what they're saying is. And in this case, it's really just because it agrees with me. So I was reading this one chapter and it was awesome and really vindicated the fact that I talk so much about the mind and I have such a high esteem of my ideas and their importance. And then I was reading another one, and I don't know that voice theory can explain consciousness, but maybe it can. Or maybe it can be an important component. And so I was reading through the second essay here, and I didn't finish it, so I wanted us to finish together. So we're going to read two essays from the book, This Explains Everything. So basically a magazine called Edge, or a website called edge.org, put out the question, what's the deepest, most elegant, most beautiful theory of how the world works, basically. And then there were a bunch of really big thinkers and scientists and people that had answers. So then this is a book of all of their answers, or of all of the best answers or whatever. And I would love to have answered this question. This was in 2013, but I think I now had the answer, which is voices theory. And so I've written a little essay explaining why it is the best. And I guess I'll share that with you in part 2. Observers, so we're on page 85 if you have the book. Observers observing. Robert Provine, neuroscientist and psychologist at the University of Maryland. Also author of the book Curious Behavior, Yawning, Laughing, Hiccuping, and Beyond. The request for a favorite, deep, elegant, and beautiful explanation left me a bit cold. Deep, elegant, and beautiful are aesthetic qualities I associate more with experience and process than explanation, especially that of the observer observing. Observation is the link between all empirical sciences and the reason physicists were among the founders of experimental psychology. The difference between psychology and physics is one of emphasis. Both involve the process of observers observing. Physics stresses the observed, psychology the observer. As horrifying as this may be to hyper-empiricists who neglect the observer, physics is necessarily the study of the behavior of physicists, biology the study of biologists, and so on. Decades ago, I discussed this issue with John Wheeler, who found it obvious, noting that a major limit on cosmology is the cosmologist. When students in my course on sensation and perception hear me say that we're engaging in the study of everything, I'm absolutely serious. In many ways, the study of sensation and perception is the most basic and universal of sciences. My passion for observation is aesthetic as well as scientific. My most memorable observations are of the night sky. Others may name the discovery of a T-Rex fossil or the sound of bird song on a perfect spring day. I read that weird because I don't actually understand what that is. To see better and deeper, I build telescopes, large and small. I like my photons fresh, not collected by CCD or analyzed by a computer. I want to encounter the cosmos head-on, letting it wash over my retina. My profession of neuroscience provides its own observational adventures, including the unique opportunity to close the circle by investigating the neurological mechanism through which the observer observes and comes to know the cosmos. I've always said psychology and physics are like, you can break down the most important studies of the world into psychology and physics. Or the ultimate goals of study of the world are to understand the self and understand the cosmos. So how the self is org. I mean, physics is basically everything, but you know, psychology is you can say it's just a part of physics, and maybe the most important application, because you need that in order to really observe. To understand, I have to understand my observation systems, my interpretive processes, all the different voices. Okay. Then we get to genes, claustrum, and consciousness. Claustrum is a brain structure. I did not know about this region or structure. So it's a bit embarrassing and also very exciting. And this is by V.S. Ramachandran, whom I do know. Not personally, but he's a neuroscientist, professor, and director at the Center for Brain and Cognition at the University of California, San Diego. He is an author of The Telltale Brain, which I have not read, but you know him from Phantom Limbs. He's the Phantom Limb guy. So he's, you know, he talked about how how amputees can feel a hand that they no longer have. And he also did a brief tour of human consciousness, which I learned a ton in, and probably contributed, I often don't think of it, but it probably contributed a great deal to my understanding of the mind. And yeah, so that's really good, really short, a brief tour of human consciousness. Okay. Claustrum is spelled like this. Okay. And that's also how Ramachandran is spelled. Don't know how it's pronounced, but... What's my favorite elegant idea? The elucidation of DNA structure is surely the most obvious, but it bears repeating. I'll argue that the same strategy used to crack the genetic code might prove successful in cracking the neural code of consciousness and self. It's a long shot, but worth considering. The ability to grasp analogies and to see the difference between deep and superficial ones is a hallmark of many great scientists. Francis Crick and James Watson were no exception. Crick himself cautioned against the pursuit of elegance in biology, given that evolution proceeds happenstantially. God is a hacker, he said, adding, according to my colleague Don Hoffman, many a young biologist has slit his own throat with Occam's razor. Yet his own solution to the riddle of heredity ranks with natural selection as biology's most elegant discovery. Will a solution of similar elegance emerge for the problem of consciousness? It is well known that Crick and Watson unraveled the double helical structure of the DNA molecule, two twisting complementary strands of nucleotides. Less well known is the chain of events culminating in this discovery. First, Mendel's laws dictated that genes are particulate. In parentheses, a first approximation still held to be accurate. Then Thomas Morgan showed that fruit flies zapped with X-rays became mutants with punctate, I don't know what that word means, changes in their chromosomes, yielding the clear conclusion that the chromosomes are where the action is. Look, if some of this loses you, it's okay, because loses me too. Chromosomes, DNA, biology, science. Chromosomes are composed of histones and DNA. As early as 1928, the British bacteriologist Fred Griffith showed that a harmless species of bacterium, upon incubation with a heat-killed virulent species, changes into the virulent species. This was almost as startling, as a pig walking into a room with a sheep and two sheep emerging. Later, Oswald Avery showed that DNA was the transformative principle here. In biology, knowledge of structure often leads to knowledge of function. One need look no further than the whole of medical history. Inspired by Griffith and Avery, Crick and Watson realized that the answer to the problem of heredity lay in the structure of DNA. Localization was critical, as indeed it may prove to be for brain function. Okay. Crick and Watson didn't just describe DNA structure, they explained its significance. They saw the analogy between the complementarity of molecular strands and the complementarity of parent and offspring. Why pigs beget pigs and not sheep. At that moment, modern biology was born. There are similar correlations between brain structure and mind function, between neurons and consciousness. I'm stating the obvious here only because there are some philosophers called new Mysterians who believe the opposite. After his triumph with heredity, I'm not one of them. After his triumph with heredity, Crick turned to what he called the second great riddle in biology, consciousness. There were many skeptics. I remember a seminar Crick gave on consciousness at the Salk Institute here in La Jolla. He'd barely started when a gentleman in attendance raised a hand and said, "Oh, but Mr. Crick, you haven't even bothered to define the word consciousness before embarking on this." I'll tell you when I get to the part I haven't read yet. But I'm realizing something I hadn't realized before. I'm very excited to talk about this. Crick's response was memorable. "I'd remind you that there was never a time in the history of biology when a bunch of us sat around the table and said, 'Let's first define what we mean by life.' We just went out there and discovered what it was, a double helix. We leave matters of semantic hygiene to you philosophers." Crick did not, in my opinion, succeed in solving consciousness, whatever it might mean. Nonetheless, he was headed in the right direction. He had been richly rewarded earlier in his career for grasping the analogy between biological complementarities, the notion of the structural logic of the molecule. The notion that the structural logic of the molecule dictates the functional logic of heredity. Given his phenomenal success using this is probably hard for you, huh, to not have it written? There are subtitles, okay, good. Given his phenomenal success using the strategy of structure-function analogy, it is hardly surprising that he imported the same style of thinking to study consciousness. He and his colleague, Christoph Koch, and he's a big deal. I know nothing of his work, but he's a really big deal in consciousness, and I just want to show you that I know that. He and his colleague Christoph Koch did so by focusing on a relatively obscure structure called the claustrum. Ooh, so we got the pen out for that. The claustrum is a thin sheet of cells underlying the insular cortex of the brain, one on each hemisphere. It is histologically more homogeneous than most brain structures, and unlike most brain structures, which send and receive signals to and from a small subset of other structures, the claustrum is reciprocally connected with almost every cortical region. The structural and functional streamlining might ensure that when waves of information come through the claustrum, which is sort of in the center, I can't really point at it. I should not be talking because of the subtitles. Whatever. The structural and functional streamlining might ensure that when waves of information come through the claustrum, its neurons will be exquisitely sensitive to the timing of the inputs. I don't understand what the implication of that is. Oh, yes, I do. Okay, now I get it. Okay. What does this have to do with consciousness? Instead of focusing on pedantic philosophical issues, Crick and Koch began with their naive intuitions. Consciousness has many attributes: continuity in time, a sense of agency or free will, recursiveness or self-awareness, etc. But one attribute that stands out is subjective unity. You experience all your diverse sense impressions, thoughts, willed actions, and memories as a unity, not as jittery or fragmented. This attribute of consciousness, with the accompanying sense of the immediate presence or the here and now, is so obvious that we don't usually think about it. We regard it as axiomatic. So this is when I went and got my phone I was like, oh my gosh, I have to share this with you guys, with my fellow risers. Because even that first essay, I was already like, because, you know, I've had people like, oh, you talk too much about the brain, and, you know, there are other things to talk about. Look, we don't have to talk about it if you don't want to talk about it, but no, there are not other things to talk about. Can you imagine if voices theory, okay, so let me pause. So I don't usually do much with consciousness. I am interested in cognition, which is like a step below consciousness. So it's all these mental processes that are happening, but not necessarily your experience of the mental processes. But it's really like it's just like the level right underneath. The reason so this hierarchy that I'm imagining, it's like, you have geneticists who talk about how, you know, then you have people that look at proteins and stuff and cell structure and stuff and cell function. And then you look at people who look at how that cell function produces cognition. Then you look at people who are just looking at like cognition. Then you have people who are way up there looking at the experience of cognition, metacognition, which is something that we might compare to consciousness. So my interests, consciousness, I think, is too hard for me right now. So my interest is just in cognition. What is happening in the mind when these behaviors, these ideas, these thoughts are produced? But of course, I bump up against, as I talk about voices and how they interact and all that, of course, I bump up against the idea of our experience of the activity of these voices. And I also have to wonder, why the fuck do other people just go crazy with their voices, and I'm over here doubting, you know, well, not all of them, but a bunch of them, or trying to, you know, and I do feel fragmented, actually, and that's why I'm able to understand these things, I think, because it is very easy for me to understand how I am just this messy mix of voices and impressions and all that stuff. I don't actually maybe feel as much of you. I do obviously feel unity. I feel like I am this individual, this thing. But I don't think I feel as much like I'm able to see how that unity, whatever. Let's hear more from Ramachandran. I'm just able to see more of the sources of, you know, if you imagine a room, and that is you, the room. I just realized, oh, okay, the windows are open. There's a whole bunch of stuff coming in from a whole bunch of different places. And all of that is actually me. And I'm just this part, this little observer. Okay, does that make sense? But like, you're over here going, no, there's nothing else. I know everything that's happening here. It's all one thing, and it's crazy. I don't understand it. All right, so it's only half a page left, okay? If you came here for Ramachandran, I mean, just get the book. Okay, so I'm very excited to see. Oh, right. But what I wanted to say is that, so I have developed little ideas about how to define consciousness or how to sort of explain it. One such idea was that I imagined that, because we're conscious of some voices, we can kind of hear them, some voices we can't. And I was wondering whether when things are sort of recorded in a memory, so there's activity somewhere in the brain, a memory, an emotion, a thought, whatever, that may be recorded into memory. So it has to pass through something in order to like be written into memory. And maybe what consciousness is all those things that pass through, which means we are conscious just like a fraction of a second after our experience. So there's this event in the brain. It's sent for potentially being saved. And then everything that goes through that is what is experienced. And then some of it's thrown out and some of it actually is saved. So it's sort of like this point where we're considering, saving these things. That's kind of a cool definition of consciousness, right? It makes it, or maybe that contributes nothing, but for me it's like, okay, so that now we can imagine sort of a localized area in the brain or localized process, or a process, a single process in the brain of this being considered for record. Not everything that we are conscious of we remember, but I think like typically we'd say that the things we remember we were conscious of at the time that they like happened, right? It's not like we just like discover memories and it's like, oh, holy shit, I have no feeling of having been there at all, but I guess sometimes that happens. But yeah, we don't always retain that feeling, but anyway, so what if that's the case? Okay, so I'm gonna read this paragraph again, and then I'm gonna finish and then I'm gonna read the last 2 paragraphs for you. What is this? No, I'm gonna read 4 paragraphs total now. The last 2, and then the next 2, which are the last 2. The claustrum is a thin sheet of cells underlying the insular cortex of the brain, one on each hemisphere. It is histologically more homogeneous than most brain structures, and unlike most brain structures, which send and receive signals to and from a small subset of other structures, the claustrum is reciprocally connected with almost every cortical structure region. The structural and functional streamlining might ensure that when waves of information come through the claustrum, its neurons will be exquisitely sensitive to the timing of the inputs. What does this have to do with consciousness? Instead of focusing on pedantic philosophical issues, Crick and Cock began their Instead of focusing on pedantic philosophical issues, Crick and Cock began with their naive intuitions. Consciousness has many attributes: continuity in time, a sense of agency or free will, recursiveness or self-awareness, etc. Integration. I don't know what recursiveness means, but maybe it's integration. But one attribute that stands out is subjective unity. You experience all your diverse sense impressions, thoughts, willed actions, and memories as a unity, not as jittery or fragmented. This attribute of consciousness, with the accompanying sense of the immediate present or the here and now, is so obvious that we don't usually think about it. We regard it as axiomatic. So a central feature of consciousness is its unity. And here is a brain structure that sends and receives signals to and from practically all other brain structures, including the right parietal, involved in polysensory convergence and embodiment, and the anterior cingulate, involved in the experience of free will. Thus, the claustrum seems to unify everything anatomically, and consciousness does so mentally. Crick and Cock recognize that this might not be a coincidence. The claustrum may be central to consciousness. Indeed, it may embody the idea of the Cartesian theater, taboo among philosophers, or at least be the conductor of the orchestra. Ooh. Oh, no. Sergeant Paul. All right, hey. It is this kind of childlike reasoning that often leads to great discoveries. Obviously, such analogies don't replace rigorous science, but they're a good place to start. Crick and Cock's idea may be right or wrong, but it's elegant. If it's right, they have paved the way to solving one of the great mysteries of biology. Even if it's wrong, students entering the field would do well to emulate their style. Crick was right. Crick was right too often to ignore. I visited him at his home in La Jolla in July of 2004. He saw me to the door as I was leaving, and as we parted, gave me a sly, conspiratorial wink. I think it's in the... What? I think it's in the claustrum, Mama. That's where the secret is. A week later, he passed away. Holy shit. If anything happens to me, my birthday video, that was me giving you the secret. All right, I love this claustrum idea. I love it, love it, love it. Love it, love it, love it. That's so cool. I just have to, not love it too much. But I'm basically now convinced that now I know what consciousness is. It's the claustrum. We have all these different voices. They're feeding in, and then the ones who stay long enough or pass through long enough in the claustrum are experience. Of course, that doesn't really define what does that mean to experience, because you want a little man standing in the the theater. That's the Cartesian theater, I think. I don't know what the Cartesian theater is, but I think that often when we think of experience and consciousness, we imagine ourselves sort of in a movie theater and we are experiencing things. And that's not the case. There is not even a single observer. So there's probably different parts of the claustrum. Well, it depends on what. So an experience comes in the claustrum, which may trigger another experience, you know, which is how we are different observers at different moments. It's different claustral activity. Love it, love it, love it, love it. So basically, thanks to Crick, thanks to Francis Crick and Eris Sill, formerly known as Francis Lawrence, we now understand cognition and the experience of cognition. That's not bad, huh? Well, that's not bad. I think my work is done. Maybe that's why I didn't want to do my birthday video, because then after that, what is there? My work is done. I've given you the... Oh, should I just do part 2 now? It's not a very good essay. It was just in one go. Okay, I'm going to try not to comment on it while I read it. Okay. So, many have acknowledged Darwin's beautiful theory of natural selection. Some defined beauty as simplicity with great consequence. Darwin's theory seems obvious now, can be explained over coffee, and itself explains our biological existence and all that entails. I accept such definitions. I would like to add another, even if it seems better suited to visual beauty. All beautiful things fall into one of two categories. A beautiful thing is either a thing that is new or a thing that has utility. Of course, if it's something that's considered harmful, which we often assume of new things, then we do not perceive it as beautiful. So beautiful things are those which are either new without threat, or useful. Considering that and others' definition of a beautiful theory as being simple and consequential, I put forth the new most beautiful theory, the most beautiful application of our understanding of the pressures of environment in biological evolution. I too acknowledge the giant on whose shoulders I type. Voice theory, as I call it today, explains our psychological existence. Simply put, the mind is an assembly of interacting mechanisms selected for survival and reproduction. Don't overthink it. I call these mechanisms voices. You've heard of neurons. They communicate with each other. They form networks and regions that communicate. And ultimately, they trigger the motor cortex or otherwise affect the senses. You can imagine a bunch of wires, some connecting to some, others connecting to others, and then some. You can imagine lines of code. If this, then this, all in competition for execution, triggered by different conditions. I like to imagine a courtroom to keep it similar, simple, familiar, and beautiful. Then I have a paragraph that just says judge myth. Voice theory and its counterpart, the judge myth, because that hasn't been filled in yet. Okay, so now we're on the next paragraph. Voice theory and its counterpart, the judge myth, are both new because there's no unit we might consider a whole self, except as a Polaroid of the activity of the parts. And that's a pretty big deal. It's also beautiful because if there's no self, then realizing error won't feel like self-harm. New and harmless. If I accept that I have an in-group, out-group voice casting its votes in my judgments and emotions, then I can accept that, just like every other human, I am racist. At some point, using race or any other criteria to distinguish community members from outsiders was advantageous. I'm alive because of my ancestors' racism. It is no longer advantageous. A line of code that is no longer useful. I am not and don't feel guilty for that line of code. The only guilt I might feel is if I let it act. But I can do that. Shit, what does that mean? Maybe I meant to say the only guilt I might feel is if I don't do something about it. But I can. We don't have to argue and fight and destroy the environment. I can identify bad voices, let others point them out like spinach in my teeth, and use my brain's self-correcting mechanisms. Because that was naturally selected. And then I just put fruit, SID theory. But our culture doesn't value mind changing, and we think that we are by default reasonable, coherent entities. So we can't begin the process until we accept the origins of our species. So that's Darwin's book, which is sort of universally considered right now the most beautiful sort of explanation. That and the helix. And so my explanation is an application of this, because that's where the voices come from, that's how we know the voices exist, blah, blah. And then today I added, on page 85, Robert Provine says in his introduction, the difference between psychology and physics is one of emphasis. Both involve the process of observers observing. Physics stresses the observed, psychology the observer. As I often proudly repeat myself as having said, physics and psychology are the two most important studies. Psychology is the study of the self, while physics is the study of everything else. I hope to have here provided the most beautiful explanation as a theory of everything for the observer, and will leave it to my intellectual superiors to explain the observed. Today we were not unproductive. We've literally explained everything now, except for the world. But we've literally given you all the tools you need to be able to make fewer errors or catch yourself making errors and exchange with other people. So you're welcome. I think I have a Patreon. So I think you can find that link somewhere, just as a thank you.